Honorable Mayor Motley, Prime Minister of Barbados, Most Honorable Percival James Patterson, former Prime Minister of Jamaica, and statesman in residence at the P.J. Patterson Center for Africa Caribbean Advocacy at the University of the West Indies Mona campus, Pro-Vice Chancellor for Global Affairs and Principal of the Open Campus of the UWI, Dr. Luz Longsword, Professor Denzel Williams, Pro-Vice Chancellor and Principal of the Five Islands Campus of the UWI, located in Antigua, Barbuda, Ambassador June Suma, Secretary General of the Association of Caribbean States and Chair of Campus Council, the OECS, Dr. Sonia Stanley Nair, Senior Lecturer and Director of the Institute of Caribbean Studies at the University of the West Indies, and my collaborator on this forum, Professor Anthony Boggs, Director of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, Brown University, Professor Carol Boyce Davies, Professor of Africana Studies and English at Cornell University, publisher and historian, Mr. Ian Randall, Dr. Henderson Carter, Senior Lecturer and Head of the History Department at the MPhil campus of the University of the West Indies, Ms. Norbasi Philip, poet, writer, lawyer, social justice advocate, staff of the Center for Reparation Research, staff of the ICS, technical or technicians, and others who helped with the organizing of this forum. All who have joined us virtually today, a very warm welcome to you. My name is Vereen Shepherd, social historian, director of the Center for Reparation Research at the UWI, and a vice chair of the CARICOM Reparation Commission. And it is my pleasure to partner with the Institute of Caribbean Studies to co-host as well as moderate this forum today, a forum focused on the university in an age of activism. The date for this forum was chosen because of its significance for the history of the Black Atlantic. On a day like today in 1781, doomed Africans on the slaver Zong, who were forcibly trafficked from West Africa to Jamaica via the horrendous Middle Passage, would have met their fate through deliberately being thrown overboard, starting with 54 women and children. The crew used the principle of general average to jettison about 132 Africans in all between November 29 and when the ship arrived in Black River, Jamaica on December 22, 1781, on the basis that they needed to make some profit of the voyage rather than lose the imperiled ship. This principle holds that a captain who jettisons part of his cargo in order to save the rest can claim for the loss from his insurers. In this case, enslaved Africans were the ones categorized as cargo and insured at £30 per person. Historians, social and political scientists, legal scholars, cultural studies experts, UN experts, gender specialists, artists, poets, novelists, human rights advocates from civil society and politicians have all over the years turned their disciplinary lens on the atrocities of the African Holocaust and helped to bring awareness of this tragedy to the global community. Among these are scholars and administrators in universities and other higher education institutions, including the University of the West Indies. Using the lens of history to understand our past is just one of the many ways in which our own UWI has showcased its social justice agenda through the work of its academics, including leading historian and administrator, Vice Chancellor Sir Hilary Beckles. The forum today will provide space for academics from various disciplines as well as for administrators, diplomats, poets, politicians, and publishers to provide a perspective on their activities in and their relationship with the university as they seek to shape or influence the inputs and outputs in service to stakeholders. The University of the West Indies, which was established in 1948 to clean up the health mess left behind by the British colonizers, had its mandate set out for it from the beginning. Decolonization of the curriculum in all disciplines, research in tropical medicine, broadening of access and alignment with the needs of a post-colonial Caribbean. The UWI has done well over these 70 plus years to fulfill this mandate. But of course, we have to protect the mandate, and we have to ensure that internal and external forces do not cause us to stray from this course. So to start us off today, our next speaker is my co-host of this event, Dr. Sonia Stanley Naya. She's a Jamaican scholar, cultural activist, writer, blogger, and international speaker. She was the first PhD cultural studies graduate from the University of the West Indies and the first to be appointed lecturer and senior lecturer in cultural studies at the UWI. She's also the inaugural Rhodes Trust Rex Nettleford Fellow in Cultural Studies and has distinguished herself as a pioneer in the terrain of Caribbean cultural studies. She is the author of the acclaimed full-length book on Jamaican dancehall titled Dancehall, From Slave Ship to Ghetto, published in 2010, and editor of Dancehall, a reader on Jamaican music and culture, published in 2020, the first compilation of seminal and current writings on dancehall music and culture. She has been the director of the Institute of Caribbean Studies and the Reggae Studies Unit at the University of the West Indies since 2015 and holds international appointments as member of the International Scientific Committee of the Slave Root Project, UNESCO, and Senior Research Associate at Rhodes University. She's a leading author, teacher, and researcher on Black Atlantic performance geographies, popular music, culture, and the sacred. She speaks to us now on Reclaiming the Drum, Reflections on the University in an Age of Activism. Dr. Naya.
And in some cases, who consider themselves too privileged to engage in social justice, policy, community building, ultimately nation building, in the spirit of the advancement of humanity versus mere knowledge creation. There is truly a danger also in the singular stories of various forms of oppression, from racialized slavery, abduction, illegal trafficking, massacres such as that which occurred on the Zong slaver, indeed genocide, intergenerational servitude, victims forced into the global sex trade, bonded labor, or forced marriage that has characterized the African and African diasporic imaginary for some time. The single story may go as follows. We are born out of slavery, and our post-colonial existence is one shaped by stripping ourselves of the vestiges of enslavement. These circumstances, colonial and post-colonial, have characterized the ways in which even peoples of African descent in a global context are made to see their realities in history books, as well as through the media, for example. While stories of the university and the post-colonial African, on the one hand privileged and on the other hand oppressed, have circulated ad nauseum, there is a tradition of activism that has characterized the scholarship and administration of persons within the academy whose works have been lifted from the paper on which they have been written to occupy, and I mean occupy, in the spirit of that social activist movement which emerged as an international progressive socio-political movement in opposition to social and economic inequality and to the lack of real democracy around the world. The Occupy movement was interested in the advancement of social and economic justice and new forms of democracy. While the Occupy movement has had many different scopes, local iterations, groups, and foci, its prime concern remained a response to hegemonic forces and indeed stories in the ontological sense that dictate a certain positionality for the majority, while the minority continue control of large corporations, the global financial system, indeed the capital to continue to control the world. By the 9th of October 2011, Occupy protests had taken place or were ongoing in some 950 cities across 82 countries and in over 600 communities in the United States. A formidable movement, right? The Occupy movement, an activist undertaking, holds lessons for universities, just as Walter Rodney did in his proverbial and literal occupation of the university, leaving serious lessons for us to live by. There is an estimated 25,000 universities globally. The Times Higher Education list only includes 1,400 of these, which includes the UWI. So much has been and can be achieved by this number of students, academics, and administrators, a critical mass of potentiality. I want to speak about the role of the university in a time of activism in the spirit of Sylvia Wynter, Mary Seacole, Leopold Senghor, Sir Arthur Lewis, Walter Rodney, Frantz Fanon, Paula Freire, Stuart Hall, Barry Evans, Rex Nettleford, Hilary Beckles, and others who seemed not only to understand the role of the humans of color in particular, the post-colonial human, but also the role of institutions such as the university. I am using this moment to invoke further the work of intellectuals and activists moving side by side with citizens for the ways in which we must topple dominant structures that oppress. I am Sonia Stanley Nair, Director of the Institute of Caribbean Studies at the University of the West Indies Mona campus and Senior Lecturer in Cultural Studies. I am pleased that the Center for Reparation Research agreed to partner with the ICS to stage this event to commemorate the Zong Massacre, as well as to recognize the role of scholars and university administrators in activism. The UWI has been at the heart of post-colonial struggles to establish nations through regional educational liberation since its inception. Therefore, activism is at the heart of this university's raison d'etre. I add my words toward this less traveled terrain of thinking on the university and activism. I center my reflections in line with the tradition in which I have written and engaged as a cultural activist, in line with aesthetic, poetic, and spiritual critiques. I use the metaphor of the drum, reclaiming the drum as a strategy in the spirit of my work, a sort of activism through performance.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nair, for your presentation and for your excellent framing of a university's mission in the post-colonial period and the context within which we have to, in a sense, avoid a singular narrative and reclaim our own drum. Thank you so much. It is now my distinct honor to introduce to you a woman who is marching to her own drum, conscious of the shoulders on which she stands and her mission as a post-colonial leader. She is the Honorable Mayor Motley, Prime Minister of Barbados. The Honorable Mayor Motley is the 8th Prime Minister of Barbados. She became the first woman to occupy that high office following general elections on May 24, 2018, in which she led the Barbados Labour Party to an emphatic victory, winning all 30 seats in the House of Assembly by the largest margin ever seen in the electoral history of Barbados. An attorney at law and Queen's Counsel, Prime Minister Motley has been active in the political life of Barbados for 3 decades. First elected in 1994, she is at present in her 6th term as Member of Parliament for the constituency of St. Michael North East. From 1994 to 2008, Ms. Motley served in the cabinet of 3 successive administrations. First as Minister of Education and Culture, then as Attorney General and Minister of Home Affairs, and then Minister of Economic Affairs. In 2003, she was appointed Deputy Prime Minister. Prime Minister Motley currently also holds the portfolios of Minister of Finance, Economic Affairs, and Sustainable Development, along with National Security and the Public Service. Honorable Prime Minister, the floor is yours.
Hello, my friends. The government of Barbados is only too pleased to identify with and to support this effort by the Center for Reparation Research and the Institute of Caribbean Studies to spread the gospel that higher education institutions, like our very own UWI, must self-consciously take on a social justice mission that is aimed at responding to and satisfying the needs of the marginalized within our societies and propelling a transformative, emancipatory, economic, social, and political agenda. A lot of words. But what am I really saying? How could this be otherwise for us as a people who have trod the historical path that we have trod? Indeed, we were reminded all of it when a few months ago the horrific George Floyd incident impelled people and institutions all around the world to reflect deeply on where they stood in relation to the system of injustice that has been too long inflicted on people of African descent. And as against that background, our House of Assembly in Barbados introduced and passed a resolution in which we confirmed that, and I quote, "The central theme that runs through the entire history of Barbados subsequent to English settlement is the struggle to overcome racial discrimination and oppression, to eradicate the many negative legacies that were derived from centuries of criminal enslavement of Africans and people of African descent, and to create a non-racist society in which the fundamental human rights of all people are respected," unquote. So we are only too well aware that our history has bequeathed to us a mission to confront and to dismantle race and class-based structures of inequality and injustice, and to establish a beloved community of human dignity, participatory citizenship, and of social and economic justice for all. This is a mission for government and for all other leadership entities within our society, and it is therefore a mission, preeminently, my friends, for our university. A university, after all, is not a mere high-level technical or vocational institution. It is rather an educational institution that is expected to possess a profound understanding of the historical journey of the community or nation that it serves, to develop a vision of what is required to elevate the community or nation to the next level of its developmental trajectory, and to actively undertake that mission, not only by educating and training a cadre of conscious and well-equipped social engineers, but also through its active engagement with and service to the community or nation. This certainly is my government's conception of the role and mission of our University of the West Indies. And I dare say it is a conception that has existed from the earliest days of our investment in UWI as an independent nation. Indeed, when the Right Excellent Earl Walton Barrow addressed the very first graduating class of the MPhil campus on the 6th of February 1968, he titled his speech, "The University and the People." And he stated as follows, and I quote, "It is of the utmost importance that our statesmen and scholars, students and scientists should all realize a university institution cannot survive unless it has as its constant goal service to the communities which support and sustain its activities. At this College of Liberal Arts and Science, we have embarked with some assistance on a task of bringing people to the university. It is vital that we should endeavor within the shortest possible time to bring the university to the people," unquote. And Prime Minister Barrow was very clear that to bring the university to the people entailed the university consciously undertaking a social justice mission. Indeed, he admonished the University of the West Indies to set out to make 2 blades of grass grow where one grew before, to train 10 persons in the same time as it would have taken to train one, to remove ignorance and squalor, to offer gainful employment to every citizen, and to preserve our cultural heritage in all its richness, unquote. I would like to think that this is how we conceive of our UWI, our university, not only in Barbados, but across the entire Caribbean community. This certainly was the concept of a modern university serving a developing country that Dr. Eric Williams urged upon the British Commission that made the recommendation for the establishment of the then University College of the West Indies back in the 1940s. At the time, the great West Indian historian disavowed the notion that the University College of the West Indies should be established as a traditional ivory tower type academic institution, removed geographically from the main centers of business, civic and governmental activity. Ultimately, Dr. Williams did not win his argument as to the appropriate geographical location to the University of the West Indies' first campus in Jamaica. But if the history of the UWI is anything to go by, one can argue that his concept of a relevant and engaged national university, identifying with the pressing needs of the people and undertaking a social justice mission, did strike a responsive chord. And I say this because we can discern in the history of our regional university a proud record of a nationally engaged university undertaking social justice and national building responsibilities at the level of its student body, at the level of its faculty members, and in its own right as an institution. Who, for example, can forget the role that the students of the Mona campus played in 1968, when under the leadership of the then president of the Guild of Undergraduates, Juan Ralph Gonzalez, the students marched into Kingston, protesting against the expulsion of Walter Rodney from Jamaica and serving as a vehicle for a major popular protest against the social conditions of the day in Jamaica. Or just to give another example, consider the role played by the students of the St. Augustine campus of UWI between 1969 and 1970, when led by such student leaders as Geddes Granger and David Darboe, they established the National Joint Action Committee, well known as NJAC, and launched a Black Power movement that shook the foundations of unholy race and class privilege in Trinidad and Tobago and provided inspiration for the entire region. Then, of course, there's the tradition of the UWI scholar activists ranging from the New World group of scholars of the 1960s, Lloyd Bess, James Millett, Norman Gervin, among others. Of course, to the legendary Dr. Walter Rodney, and onward to a MPhil campus public intellectual tradition built around the likes of Dr. Frank Allen and the late Wendell McLean and Dr. Neville Duncan and Dr. George Bell and now Sir Hilary Beckles. And of course, there are many alumni who have taken the education and the philosophical groundings that they received at the UWI and have gone on to distinguish themselves as political and civil society leaders, national statesmen, champions of the people, and even in some cases, the very conscience of the nation. Their names are simply too many to even recall, but they have all added to the glorious nature of the Caribbean civilization being a humanizing factor to the rest of the world. But the university itself as an institution also has a proud record as an architect of social justice and of economic emancipation. And nowhere is this record richer or more relevant than the role played by the University of the West Indies in fostering the contemporary regional and global reparations movement. Indeed, the said Center for Reparations Research that is co-hosting this virtual University in an Age of Activism event is a critical component of the entire reparations campaign infrastructure, to say nothing of the monumental role played by the Vice-Chancellor of the University, Sir Hilary Beckles. And if I may, it was in fact when I could not go to Durban for the World Conference Against Racism and Xenophobia that I invited Sir Hilary Beckles to take my position, having just been appointed Attorney General less than 24 hours before. And it is against that background that we have seen Sir Hilary and the university build in a very credible way to allow us now to be able to take this argument as far as we are taking it globally, recognizing that there is now a moment whose time has come. But as much as we can point to this impressive historical record, we all know that we have not yet accomplished the mission of making that commitment to social justice impulse an intrinsic part of all aspects of the university, to make it an intrinsic part, so to speak, of our DNA. And I say so conscious that there are still far too many lecturers and professors, perhaps, who may see themselves undertaking the role of public intellectual in a way that is not comfortable for them, or who may not necessarily want to put their knowledge and experience at the service of communities or across the country. They see themselves in a narrow, straight way, in a box, so to speak. There are still too many students who enter our university and graduate 3 or 4 years later without any real understanding that they're expected to play a positive social engineering leadership role within the society that sponsored and financed their education. This morning, in addressing Barbadian children, as we celebrate our own independence here in this country, I had cause to reflect on the difference between what is required between leadership and management. Leadership is doing the right thing, and we need to reinforce that in all of our students so that leadership may emerge at every level of our society, in every sphere of our society. Management is about doing things right, and the difference between the two needs to be drilled home in all of our people, because we have too often not seen examples of leadership at every level of our society across every space that we can have it. University of the West Indies has a responsibility in helping us in this respect. We also know that there is more that we can do and that the university can do with us to make itself relevant to the urgent social justice and the development needs of where our people are today. And God knows that we need such an engaged activist university, that we need also to ensure that conscious and socially committed students, faculty members and graduates, now more than ever, need to help us step up to the plate to fight all of these battles that we are now fighting across the region, from the climate crisis to the pandemic to the new development trajectory that must engage us if we are to get as many of our people out of the positions in which they found themselves at birth, to be able to move from poverty to prosperity. Yes, the need is urgent, and it is urgent for the simple reason that the existential challenges that I referred to are likely to challenge the very viability of our states as sovereign entities. One of the strategies that my government has employed here in Barbados is the restoration of the benefit of free education to all Barbadian students at the University of the West Indies, but with one condition, a condition that they undertake voluntary service to the community and give of their knowledge and skills to the people of Barbados. It is an activist intervention. For decades, we took responsibility for paying for our students. Regrettably, there was a 5-year period in which they had to assume responsibility between 2013 and 2018. My government reintroduced the commitment to pay for them. But it is critical this time around that we have a program of give back, because it is only through that give back that we can build the social capital and generally ensure the widest possible exposure of our students to the communities from which they come. That is a determination of our commitment to be activists with respect to the kind of society we want to build. In addition, we are currently in the process of designing a system of community-based local governance, a system of people's assemblies. We propose to make provision for a number of student representatives at the tertiary level to serve in these various people's assemblies. My government has also, at the same time, created a division of reparations and economic enfranchisement in the Prime Minister's office, and they have been tasked with the responsibility of helping us craft a program not only generally of economic enfranchisement, but also of affirmative action, so that persons who have hitherto been invisible within the context of an independent Barbados or an independent Caribbean can now be seen and given an opportunity to participate fully in our communities. These things are critical because in a very real sense, we have not bridged the gap that has existed since independence by closing it completely. We've gone a long way, but we still have a good distance to travel. And too many of our people still are not engaging at a level that they find comfortable, largely because if we speak to them in one voice that only sees them being part of a community that reads literature or that does heavy studying without recognizing and realizing that the real opportunities for intellectual activism also exist within the bowels of our communities and also are expressed by those who I call our poets, the lyricists, whether in reggae or calypso, who carry the aspirations of our people and who have spoken out valiantly against the injustices that have been done to them. Black Stallion and Sufferers represents one of those songs that ought to be dissected and pulled apart and looked at in every possible light to begin to understand why he had to write it and why it is still a voice that represents too many of our people in the Caribbean. So I want to conclude by assuring you that we have literally to be able to continue to keep that bridge between those who work within academia and those who live in our communities. And if we don't do that through a process of activism, in the same way that as governments, we have had to have an activist approach towards social and economic engineering, if we don't do that, then I fear we will not see all of our people come out from the bowels of poverty as we should have seen many years ago had we been able to benefit fully from the wealth generated by our people for decades and centuries in this part of the world. The university can help us bridge that gap. And I want to assure you that the government and people of Barbados will continue to work with the decision-making leaders of the university to take a fresh look at our academic programs with a view to determining where we may be failing to give our students the educational experiences that will cement a greater level of consciousness of themselves as rooted sons and daughters of the Caribbean, and as social engineers with a vocation to expand our people's historic quest, not just for justice, but also to take our nations to a higher plane of existence and to bring prosperity to our region and to our people. We have difficult discussions that we must engage in, and those difficult discussions can be anchored by those who have had the benefit of higher education and who can therefore help to interpret what the issues are for those who have not yet made the journey. If that is seen as a necessary road on which we must travel, then I have every confidence that we will lift this Caribbean civilization to a higher level of purpose and to a higher level of achievement for all in whose name we act. Let us therefore, my friends, resolve to adhere to Mr. Barrow's admonition to take the university to the people. And let us commit to making the impulse to engage in positive and uplifting social activism that very DNA of our UWI. I wish all of you a very meaningful and enlightening event, and I do look forward in the very near future to seeing the fruits of your exertions reflected in positive institutional changes, not only in our university, but also in our communities as a result of keeping that bridge between the university and the communities of the region alive and active. Thank you, and God bless.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister Motley, for your remarks. And do continue on that decolonization path that is obvious that Barbados continues to pursue. Our next speaker is Most Honorable P.J. Patterson, former Prime Minister of Jamaica and a graduate of the UWI. He is very committed to the development of the UWI and is especially supportive of its social justice agenda. He is currently statesman in residence at the P.J. Patterson Center for Africa-Caribbean Advocacy at the UWI. It was officially launched at the university on Friday, June 26, 2020. The new center's mandate is to coordinate public policy and advocacy in fostering development relations between the Caribbean and Africa. Most Honorable P.J. Patterson was Jamaica's Prime Minister from 1992 to 2005, serving also as leader of the People's National Party. He is well regarded for his commitment to regionalism. He was a lead negotiator for the African, Caribbean, and Pacific, or ACP group, during the Lomé Convention. He oversaw external negotiations involving the World Trade Organization, the Free Trade Area of the Americas, and the Economic Partnership Agreement. He has worked closely with the African Union, which appointed him relevant Caribbean statesman when it named the diaspora as a sixth region of the continent in 2003, a testament to his Pan-Africanism. His recent book, My Political Journey, Jamaica's Sixth Prime Minister, was published by the University of the West Indies Press and is a must-read for all those keen to understand his journey from the Hanover Hills to Jamaica House and beyond. Mr. Patterson, you have the floor.
I want to heartily commend the Center for Reparation Research at the UWI, who in collaboration with the Institute of Caribbean Studies has arranged this virtual event on the university in an age of activism. The date selected is deliberate, as it marks the anniversary of the Zong Massacre in 1781, ahead of its arrival in Black River. It was an event that increased the activism around emancipation, and it still inspires the work of scholar activists at various universities. It illustrates how universities, including our own UWI, can contribute to the ongoing dialogue in the tradition of Walter Rodney and the commitment of the current Vice Chancellor, Sir Hilary Beckles, to reflect how institutions of learning can act in discharge of their search for social justice responsibilities and thereby satisfy the needs of the marginalized, civil society, and governments, and to participate in transformative leadership. We must seek for the truth and tell the story which must guide us in the single space which all humankind are confined to share, Mother Earth. Social activism should not be defined as limited to marches and demonstrations, although these may be necessary when all else fails. It includes scholarship and research. More often than not, it can be expressed through publications, press articles, radio and television interviews. With the advent and spread of technology, the social media is now, if it hasn't already, become the most effective vehicle for the spread of information. By way of example, we have witnessed how it served as a catalyst for the Arab Spring, which toppled long-established regimes and secured irreversible changes in dictatorial hierarchies. Beginning on November 29th, 1781, exactly 239 years ago, 132 enslaved Africans were thrown overboard and drowned on the slave trading ship, the Zong, in order that their owners could collect insurance on their lives. The overcrowded ship left the Gold Coast on 18th August 1781 with 442 enslaved Africans. That was twice the number of people the ship could accommodate. Due to navigational errors, the ship lost its way and ran short of water. When the Zong arrived in Black River, Jamaica on the 22nd December, there were 208 enslaved people because 234 lives were lost at sea. Atlantic slave trade. It highlights the fact that from the 16th to the 19th century, enslaved labor laid the foundations for Western capitalism in the United States, Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean. That system was reorganized after World War II, with the dominance of the victorious Allies, excluding the Soviet Union, in shaping the world economy. I have repeatedly pointed out that the Bretton Woods system, set up after World War II, excluded the nations of Africa and the Caribbean. We were still colonies without a voice or presence at the negotiating table. It is time for our voice to be heard in the shaping of the new international architecture. International activism, which includes our universities, must do the work necessary to ensure that the international system is reformed so that the majority of the world's people are represented and have a say in global governance. It was as a student at the UCWI that I got my initiation in student activism on the international stage. As chairman of the External Commission in the Guild of Undergraduates, I traveled to conferences in Ceylon, Ghana, and Nigeria. The International Students' Conference denounced racism, the suppression of academic freedom, and breaches of fundamental human rights. UWI students have had a tradition of activism around issues of social and racial justice. That was evident in the years after the student demonstrations against the ban of Dr. Walter Rodney in October 1968, which had an impact on students at campuses of the UWI and extended also to the Caribbean diaspora. Dr. Walter Rodney's lectures and talks in rural and urban communities of Africa and Black Power led to his being banned from re-entering Jamaica after he had attended a Black Writers' Conference in Montreal, Canada. The Guild of Undergraduates, led by its then president Ralph Gonzalez, organized a demonstration against the ban, which was supported by several thousand people. This set in motion a movement that engaged the society with questions about social, economic, and racial inequality within our region. We live in an era when the entire world is besieged by two global pandemics, COVID-19 and racism. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed vast disparities between those who live in poverty and those who don't. It has magnified disparities between those with access to life-saving resources and those who don't. Blacks and other people of color overwhelmingly outnumber other groups that live in poverty. COVID-19 pandemic has amplified the enormous chasm between the significant number of people of color who succumb to a COVID-19 diagnosis and their white counterparts. People of color in the USA, where the pandemic is most rampant, die at substantially higher rates than white Americans. Some groups of African Americans dying at a rate 6 times higher than their white peers. That the COVID-19 pandemic mostly devastates communities of color is not surprising. It results from another plague, long-standing systemic racism rooted in the gravest crime that humankind has ever committed against God and man. The crime of globalized slavery is the foundation on which the culture, wealth, power, and influence of the Western world were built. Although devastating, we hope the COVID-19 pandemic will one day no longer herald such widespread loss and ruination. Vaccines are on the horizon. The issue for people of color everywhere is accessing effective vaccines. On this and on the other raging pandemic that is racially motivated injustice, we cannot remain silent. Inaction is tantamount to complicity. We must stand up, speak out, and support activists who drive solutions that determine outcomes. The killing of George Floyd sparked outrage across the entire world. The fury led to Black Lives Matter protests that spread from the United States to cities worldwide, including Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. Those demonstrations are clear evidence that people outside of the US identify with the US racist experience and struggle with inequities at home, including unjust power structures. Still, the worldwide protests signify that the world is in an age of activism that unites millions of people, diverse in ethnic range, to fight against the pandemic of racial injustice. The University of the West Indies serves the descendants of enslaved Africans and Indian indentured laborers and continues to ensure through quality education the social mobility of its students, many of whom are from humble backgrounds. I know from years of political leadership that as a result of COVID-19 and flood rains in Jamaica, the contraction of the economy, the reduction in personal incomes, the result will be that government revenue and debt servicing budgets are being adversely affected. We have, nevertheless, to ensure that access to higher education is expanded, not reduced. This, therefore, requires us all to step up to the plate. The private sector must realize their compelling need for graduates in their business operations. And we as alumni must give something back to the debt we owe for our access to tertiary education. Let us draw inspiration from the victories of our ancestors who survived the ravages of the Middle Passage. Let us encourage and amplify the discourse of marginalized peoples everywhere. Strive for slavery reparations. Let us promote investments to eradicate poverty and acknowledge the diverse identities and experiences of Black slave descendants in the USA, the Caribbean, and elsewhere, and of Black migrants from the Caribbean, Africa, and elsewhere to the developed countries. Let us develop and implement global policies that foster non-discriminatory practices and ensure equal treatment by law. Let us always remember we were founded to be a shining light in the West. Oriens ex Occidente lux. We must remain in the vanguard of the quest for liberty and justice, now and during the years ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Patterson, for your remarks. You continue to be a good partner with the Center for Reparation Research. Dr. Luz Longsword and PVC Denzel Williams will now make their presentations in that order. But let me introduce you to them. Well, first to Dr. Luz Longsword, who is the Pro-Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of the West Indies Open Campus, which is the online and flexible learning campus of the university. Dr. Longsword also holds a portfolio of Pro-Vice Chancellor Global Affairs. She holds a doctorate in Business Administration in Higher Education Management from the University of Bath in the United Kingdom, a Bachelor of Arts in Spanish and French, first-class honors, no less, a Master of Business Administration Marketing from the University of the West Indies, Mona, and a Master of Arts degree in Hispanic Studies from Queen's University, Ontario, Canada. Her research focus is in the fields of leadership development and organizational transformation and change in higher education. Dr. Longsword currently chairs several boards, including the UWI's Press Board and the board of the UWI Open Campus Early Childhood Centers of Excellence. Keenly community-oriented, Dr. Longsword has worked with at-risk youth in Western Jamaica, in Belize, in Barbados, and the British Virgin Islands, as well as served on the boards of several community-based organizations. The title of her presentation is The University of the West Indies, an Activist Global Engagement Strategy. I give you Dr. Luz.
Well, first of all, let me say thank you so much to the Center for Reparation Research and the Institute of Caribbean Studies for inviting me to speak very briefly on the global engagement strategy of the University of the West Indies and how it is underpinned by our activist role as a university. It's a real pleasure to be here in this forum looking at the university in an age of activism. It's a very timely webinar at this point, and we want to look a little bit at our own role as a university and in terms of how we have developed a global strategy that also enhances our activist role. So I will look briefly at our regional and then our global strategy, and then I will focus on our activism through our engagement with global partners, but specifically through the joint institutes that have been formed since 2016. And then to tie it up, I will look at how these institutes and centers have actually promoted and supported the UWI's activist agenda. Of course, since the 2017 strategic plan was released, the Vice Chancellor articulated the fact that our university was an activist and an ethical university, and it was underpinned by a AAA vision of access, alignment, and agility, all of which were aimed at revitalizing Caribbean development. Revitalizing Caribbean development is our mission statement, and it is our regional remit that the University of the West Indies has had probably from its formation in 1948, but certainly has grown exponentially since 1962. And we see how that activist remit has led to our expansion to include all of our English-speaking former Commonwealth colonies, to include all of those in the UWI family, and to the extent that we have formed in the last 15 years, 2 new campuses, one the open campus that led to the online and distance learning outreach to those countries that did not have a campus, a physical campus, that those being Trinidad, Jamaica, and Barbados. And most recently last year to the establishment of the Five Islands campus, which of course is now the campus that will support the growth in penetration of higher education for the Eastern Caribbean, recognizing that we are experiencing the lowest enrollment in higher education in the hemisphere. So that's our regional activist role in teaching and learning. In terms of access, the Open Campus has been a part of that activism in looking at different and varied pathways for our people to access university education, utilizing shorter courses, continuing and professional education, and actually accrediting experiential learning through prior learning assessment. So the university has always had a very strong regional activist agenda. But our vision statement, and this is what I'll focus on, speaks to us as a global university rooted in the Caribbean. And there are two parts to that statement, which is very clear in terms of our own role in being active throughout the world. Globally recognized, but with a Caribbean focus and with an agenda that is going to promote and develop our Caribbean peoples wherever they are. And I have styled that as an activist strategy for global engagement. So over the past 5 years, we have been pretty busy. Of course, that's our Vice Chancellor who's been very, very busy. And he articulated in 2015 the vision that the UWI would be physically on every continent except perhaps Antarctica within 5 years. And we have already exceeded our original plan with joint centers with universities of excellent reputations across the world. In Latin America, we've started a center in Bogota, Colombia. In the USA, a center in New York. In Canada, a center in Toronto. In Cuba, a center in Havana. In Italy, a center in Florence. In the UK, in England and Scotland. In China, a center in Suzhou province, as well as in Africa, we've had centers in Nigeria and South Africa. And I have a question sign here because most recently the Vice Chancellor has indicated that we have been receiving interest in setting up a joint center in Australia. All these centers are formed in collaboration with institutions, but with clear agenda that are linked very, very closely to the UWI's activism. In the USA, the SUNY UWI Center focuses on leadership and sustainable development, and particularly on linking the Caribbean diaspora with the Caribbean and with the New York business and political environment. So here we see again a center that is focusing on the advancement of Caribbean people in both the US and in the Caribbean. The Canada Caribbean Institute, formed with Brock University, has a focus on trade, migration, and cultural exchanges. And again, long relationships in those areas with Canada, major trading partner, a major supporter of trade with the Caribbean. In the European Union, post-Brexit, we have linked with the European University Institute to focus on EU CARIFORUM trade, economic development, and policy collaboration, particularly post-Brexit. This is an important area for advocacy for the region. How is the region going to develop its relationship with the European Union now? In Cuba, we have started with the University of Havana an Institute for Sustainable Development of the Caribbean, focusing on tropical medicine research and sustainable agriculture. Again, areas of collaboration of strengths for both University of Havana and the UWI. With the University of Glasgow, well known, there is a center, joint center that is focusing on reparatory justice, another key area which is tied in with all of these other centers because economic development, health, upliftment of the diaspora, all of those things are part of the reparatory justice agenda. With the University of Coventry in the UK, we've focused on entrepreneurship and industry alignment. In Colombia, sustainable development. In Johannesburg, global African studies. And in Nigeria, Lagos, University of Lagos, African and diaspora studies. again, linking peoples of African diaspora with the motherland, as well as looking at joint advocacy for people of color. In the Suzhou, China Institute, it is a global institute for software engineering, recognizing again that this region is behind on digital transformation. The University of the West Indies formed this alliance, which is training young software engineers and giving them exposure in China, and then returning to the region to help in the development of our digital transformation project. So here we can see that our centers are not only for internationalization in terms of international student exchange, faculty and staff exchange, a joint research, but they also have an underlying program of activities that help and that guide our policy advocacy as well as our own activism as a university. So if we look at how the activities cluster, we can see clearly the activist developmental agenda of the UWI's global engagement in the areas of climate change, sustainable development, reparatory justice, trade and economic development, building bridges with the diaspora, innovation and entrepreneurship. And together, this is the foundational agenda which guides our global engagements. We have multiple partnerships, but it is clear that our partnerships are not ad hoc. They are not only for the typical internationalization, revenue generation, or even joint research. The agenda guides our activism, and it also reflects the areas in which the University of the West Indies is a clear and loud voice, both in the Caribbean and globally. So I want to just thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to really look at how the Global Affairs Office and our global strategy sees activism as part of our strategic planning. And I will end by saying that a university must demonstrate its activism, not only through public advocacy, but also in its teaching and learning, its ethical interactions with partners, and its global engagement. So for the UWI, activism is a strategic imperative for all of its activities. It is not an independent activity. And we see that clearly in how we are going about in terms of our global engagements. So with that very brief presentation, I thank you. I thank the organizers for giving our Office of Global Affairs this space to share some of our activities and our approaches with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, PVC Longsword. And I turn now to PVC Denzel Williams. He is, of course, Professor of International Business and Pro-Vice Chancellor, Industry Academic Partnerships and Planning at the University of the West Indies. He's a former Executive Director of Mona School of Business and Management at the UWI Mona campus, the largest business school in the Caribbean. He obtained a BSc degree with first class honors in economics and management studies, an MSc degree in international business from the UWI between 1996 and 2001. In 2006, he obtained a PhD in international business and strategy from Manchester Business School, University of Manchester in the UK. And I'm told that he has overtaken, and he has taken this title. He's the youngest person to be promoted to the rank of professor in the history of the UWI Mona campus, and also the first person in the over 40-year history of business and management education at the UWI Mona campus to be promoted to the rank of professor. I paused there because there was somebody else who had this honor, but obviously has been overtaken. Okay, so he's now PVC and principal of the newest campus of UWI, the Five Islands campus in Antigua, Barbuda. The title of his presentation is Promoting Activism Through the UWI's AAA Agenda. I give you PVC Williams.
Promoting Activism Through the UWI AAA Agenda. University in the Age of Activism is an important and timely forum hosted by the Center for Reparation Research and the Institute of Caribbean Studies at the UWI. I would like to congratulate both entities for planning the forum and inviting me to speak. I would like to frame my short presentation within the context of the vision and framework within which advocacy takes place at our UWI. Without a framework to guide actions and measure outcomes, activism can become just that, activism without transformational impact. So, activism, for it to be effective and transformational, must be grounded in a broader vision which is translated into objectives and outcomes in order for it to have impact. The UWI AAA strategy is that framework which provides the direction for our activism as a university during this period of activist drive by universities as part of the broader call for social justice. Our plan is grounded in three fundamental pillars: access, alignment, and agility. As it relates to access in our AAA plan speaks to us providing educational opportunities for the underserved communities within the Caribbean region. When we speak of the underserved communities, let us look at some data to tell you where we are with access to tertiary education in our region. In this hemisphere, we are ranked almost at the bottom in terms of access to post-secondary education. In the OECS, we have only 23% of our population moving on to post-secondary education. In Barbados, it's about 57%. In Jamaica, it's about 27%. When we compare that with countries like Singapore, 80%, the United Kingdom, over 60%, the United States, over 80%, we see that we have a problem of getting our people in the region to access tertiary education. We must do more if the Caribbean is to enjoy the levels of growth and development that is so desired to move our people forward. We must do more to get more people into tertiary education. The only way to benefit from the globalization and internationalization of markets and production and distribution of goods and services is to have more of our people participating in the knowledge economy. And so access is a critical part of our agenda for activism. Similarly, we have alignment. Alignment in our AAA vision for this university really calls for the academe to meet industry partners and convert the knowledge that we derive in the academic space to production and productive use for industry in order to create wealth that can move our people forward. Our activism is geared towards partnership for development, not to build walls to development, but to build bridges. And so we partner in a constructive and ethical manner with our industry sector in order to deliver the goods and services that are needed so that we can move our developmental agenda forward. Our developmental challenge is not monolithic. And so what we need are partners in government, partners in industry, and partners in academia to work together to overcome these challenges. That is what our alignment pillar calls for in our strategic plan. Similarly, our strategic plan also has access as a foundation. And access really argues that we should make our processes as a university nimble enough to respond to all opportunities in our local, regional, and global environment. We will look at our processes and make sure that they can facilitate us to be activists while we bring transformational change to our region. So it is this AAA framework that has provided the kind of framework and bedrock on which we build our activism as a university. The UWI AAA framework, therefore, provides a good roadmap for the institution to drive its activism agenda and forge partnerships to serve our national, regional, and global communities. Our role as an activist university is to help to overcome poverty, inequality in the distribution of resources, racial and religious tensions, among other issues that have held back the progress of humanity as we know it today. Our university is fully activist as we speak. We have activism on reparations. We have activism on governance. We have activism in the economic transformation of our societies. We have activism on the climate and the environment. We have activism in gender issues, among many other areas that we actually are activists in as a university. Our AAA framework provides us with that roadmap that we can ferment our activism in a way that we will not only be activists, but we will be transformational in what we do. We will continue to shine as a university because we have the tools, we have the leadership, we have the resources that will now propel us to become even more activists as we frame out the final phases of our AAA agenda. Activism as a university is an important part of what we do. We will continue to build that activist university as we close out our AAA strategy for 2022. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, PVC Williams, blazing a trail down there in Antigua, Barbuda. It's now my pleasure to invite Professor Carol Boyce Davies from Cornell University and Professor Boggs to bring her and his unique perspective on the topic we're engaging with today. First, Professor Boyce Davies. She is the H.T. Rhodes Professor of Humane Letters and Professor of Africana Studies and English at Cornell University. She is the author of the prize-winning Left of Karl Marx, the Political Life of Black Communist Claudia Jones, published in 2008. And she's also published the classic Black Women, Writing and Identity, Migration of the Subject, published in 1994. She also published Caribbean Spaces, Escape Routes from Twilight Zones. That was in 2013. And that focuses on the internalization of Caribbean culture. And she also published a bilingual children's story, Walking. And this was published in Haitian Creole and English and distributed as part of an educational project in Haiti by the Kellogg Foundation. Walking and Avon. In addition to over 100 essays, articles published in major professional journals, Dr. Boyce Davies has also published 13 critical editions on African diaspora and Caribbean literature and culture, such as the 2-volume collection of critical and creative writing, Moving Beyond Boundaries, published in 1995. She also published International Dimensions of Black Women's Writing, Volume 1, and Black Women's Diaspora, Volume 2. And her publication portfolio is just too large for me to read more of her publication. But she now speaks to us on reparations, knowledge, and the decolonial university. Over to you, Professor Carol Boyce Davies, and thank you so much for your generosity in agreeing to be in this forum today.
Hi, Carol Boyce Davies, coming from Cornell University and bringing greetings to my colleague and friend, Chancellor Sir Hilary Beckles, all my colleagues at the University of the West Indies and my larger Caribbean community, greetings. Today I'm going to talk about reparations, knowledge, and the decolonial university. In the introduction to Decolonizing the Academy, 2003, a collection of essays, one of the products of a conference on African Diaspora Studies during my 10 years Director of African Diaspora Studies at Florida International University, I asserted that the Academy, meaning the university and the larger knowledge production apparatus, remains one of the most colonized of spaces. In every discipline, one is confronted with the production of knowledge that assumes European epistemologies and ideas as the only significant ones or recognized ideas to be circulated. This thereby creates a hierarchy of knowledge in which African people's experiences still remain at the bottom in the same measure as our Black lives still today. Sylvia Wynter, in Unsettling the Coloniality of Being, Power, Truth, Freedom Toward the Human After Man, Its Overrepresentation and Argument, asserts that our current struggles are to secure the well-being and therefore the full cognitive and behavioral autonomy of the human species, ourselves that is, in the face of Western bourgeois conception of the human, which represents itself as though it were the only human, the human itself that is. For Wynter, then, struggles of race, class, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, the sustainability of the environment in the face of global warming, severe climate change, the sharply unequal distribution of the earth's resources are part of a systematic pattern to claim our humanity in the face of this Western bourgeois ethnic class man, which claims humanity for himself, along with all the world's resources, I would add, and leaves us constantly having to reassert our rights, our humanity, our right also to breathe. Significantly, Wynter herself had earlier in her work at the Institute of the Black World defined or understood Black studies as an insurgent field organized to provide a knowledge component of the various political and social movements, demanding correction then at the epistemological or knowledge production level. However, she saw the current iteration of Africana studies or Black studies as having lost its way. And on how we mistook the map for the territory and re-imprisoned ourselves in our unbearable wrongness of being, of the etc., Black Studies Toward the Human Project, she recalled some of those aesthetic and political movements which actually wanted a whole new system of ideas. Instead, we never arrived at the new place. Instead of having fully arrived at the territorial place where we could claim to rewrite the script of anti-Blackness then, we ended up being re-territorialized under Eurocentric whiteness and its assumptions of the control of knowledge, thereby a continued violence at the epistemological level, which also leaves us unable to breathe. The graphic representations of the visual I can't breathe suffocations ended up having symbolic resonances and multiplicative effect, as we saw during the activism of this past year. Essentially, declining material conditions continue to suffocate the masses of Black people in many locations. And in advancing these paradigms, the academics in the neo-colonial or post-colonial context, if we follow Walter Rodney's argument, are the ones, therefore, creating the limits, i.e., the ruling class, the ideas of the dominant class remain status quo, the systematizing and institutionalizing of racism, class and gender exploitation, and the appropriation of labor of others, particularly women, as Claudia Jones would term it, in her super exploitation of the Black woman thesis, remain then part of the normative handling of us in these institutional contexts. Thereby, the idea of the acceptance of the status quo is built in to the academic context. Even Africana studies then, meant to be transformative, has not extended to match the current knowledge available in fields and the geographical reach of the Black experience, remaining only then with partial coverage of US African American experience and perhaps a little African history, very little Caribbean coverage. So how do we repair this damage that has gone on and that has been done to the Black person, the Black subject, and go back therefore and reclaim some of this lost direction, go back then to the map as it were? First of all, every discipline in the current university context has to be minimally a counter-discourse or have it represented within its curricula and research frameworks as a counter-narrative. Such is the case, for example, in our recent move to change the name of Cornell's English department, and with that change also its curricular representations, so that medieval Europe, medieval studies, and the pre-18th century England is not the dominant distributional mandate for students as it is now. We argued then, following Ngugi wa Thiong'o's et al. Abolition of the English Department in 1968, that the English departments have tended to be one of those institutions complicit in maintaining dominant structural inequities by the very nature of their namings and orientations in terms of what they teach and how they teach it. We were pleased that our department included, ahead of this change, a vibrant body of subjects of inquiry which were not captured by the current naming. So we began a series of discussions to challenge ourselves and our context, resulting in the document that our colleagues, by their affirmation as signatories, have demonstrated that the need then to create a more just and equitable department, arguing then for a move to a Department of Literatures in English. I want to make one substantial point then within this context of talking about reparations claims and what I call the decolonial university. The CARICOM reparations claims represents a renewed aspect of an ongoing historical conversation about what is still owed Black people, approachable from a variety of viewpoints, from post-enslavement demands for repatriation and reparations, to Rastafari, in Cobra, and of course the current CARICOM movement. In fact, if we use the lens of, let's say, the Black Lives movements, we can, and I say movements in plural deliberately, we can assert that they carry at their core the argument that Black lives are often without value in the scheme of things, from police brutality on the streets to the academy, and therefore to coverage, right? The normalizing of Black objection then has always been the need to be challenged in this new attempt to reclaim humanity and put us back on the table, it seems, historically. So how do we talk about this? Among the reparations claims, as you know, we have, and I'll repeat the list just because I need to pull out one of them: full formal apology, repatriation, Indigenous Peoples Development Program, cultural institutions, public health crises, illiteracy eradication, African Knowledge Program. That's the one I want to linger on for a bit. Psychological rehabilitation is number 8, technology transfer number 9, and debt cancellation number 10. So the one I want to focus here is, of course, the knowledge one. So several of these reparative claims we can do ourselves, of course. Several require government intervention, debt cancellation, and so on. Reparations, as we know, does not only assume that it is only a governmental to people process of handouts, but a series of reparative steps. What is in our purview then in the context of an institutional academic context? This is the knowledge production area. This is the one I want to talk about briefly here, the epistemic, therefore. I want to therefore linger on that for a minute. In the reparative justice item under knowledge, this is what it says. The forced separation of Africans from their homeland has resulted in cultural and social alienation from identity and existential belonging. Denied the right in law to life and divorced by space from their source of historic self, Africans have craved the right to return our knowledge of the root to roots. A program of action is required to build bridges of belonging. Such projects as school exchanges and culture tours, community and artistic performance programs, entrepreneurial and religious engagements, as well as political interaction, are required in order to neutralize the void created by slave voyages. Such actions will serve to build knowledge networks that are necessary for community rehabilitation. Doing quick cultural analysis then, as we do, some items jump out right away. Cultural and social alienation from identity and existential belonging, knowledge of the root to roots, building bridges of belonging, neutralizing the void created by the slave voyages, building knowledge networks that are necessary for community rehabilitation, right? Those are some of the quick cultural terms that jump out at us right away. But how does all of this matter then in the current university, as we said from the start, a site of colonized identities? In my view then, we have to imagine a decolonial university. This decolonial university is my imagined university. It's an impossibility in that larger meaning, aspirational nonetheless, but therefore possible, right? As we consider a range of subjects for larger advancing of knowledge, there still remains then incomplete knowledge acquisition process that continue that epistemic violence on our students unless we ourselves are able to account for, at least admit, missing areas of study, i.e. what is left out. Putting in place then a pattern to ensure that the scholarship of thinkers from a range of locations have equal access rather than the exportation of products always including knowledge in a unidirectional model. In other words, the knowledge process I'm suggesting often comes Europe or US to these other locations, whether you're talking about Africa or the Caribbean, and often not the other way around. So in my view then, a decolonial university will have to attend to that question of how we reposition the directional relationship between how knowledge is produced. The possibilities include, for me, going back then to reclaim the original impetus which started many of the movements for Black liberation, going all the way back probably even to the 1900 Pan-African Conference to see what they were arguing. And the point I'm making is that there have been a series of conferences and resolutions and meetings from throughout the entire 20th century with this in mind, this attempt to really get at how do we rehabilitate the Black experience. So to me, one has to go back then and study those, see what's usable and see what's available to be applied if we want to talk about the whole question of decolonizing the knowledge or the institutional process. Go back for me, for sure, to reclaim the initial impetus of Black Studies programs, departments, and institutes, many of which remain captured by sometimes very specific interests, still battling for space sometimes in that same university hierarchy. Create new paradigms that go beyond the received nation-state formations which dominate now. And I want to suggest in all of that, and it seems gratuitous because I'm from the Caribbean, but for me, Caribbean studies, which is often a drop in the academic ocean, rejected even by some Africana studies departments, can easily be one of the centers of concentrations of Black experience anywhere and radiate from that in terms of how knowledge is produced. Indeed, in my view, Caribbean universities should be those places from which all of this knowledge of the Caribbean emanates, especially in this time of post-COVID technological communication advancements. And finally then, how does a university respond to its community's needs? A project then, for me in the larger context of the community, has to address the way that children are taught, the way that our community gets knowledge in general. And this probably is an issue that still remains, that has to be constantly addressed as we move forward. So as we move then beyond the colonial university, we can begin to imagine a decolonial university then moving outside of the boundaries then of the institutional frameworks, which I'm suggesting is what has just happened in this post-COVID technological advancement. We've actually moved out of the walls of the university. I, for example, teach in a different context than I did before, and many of us are doing the same thing, right? So we navigate always, on the one hand, then with a past of dignity and legendary greatness, and on the other, the starkness of the initial history of dispossession, economic difficulty, brought on sometimes by our own horrendous leadership, often in collusion with external actors. Think of Nigeria, right? And the fact that you would have that kind of move from Nigeria, which was referred by this current president, who I call the past president, as a S-hole country. And then you have the president still endorsing it, but also using a lot of the paradigms and ideas that come from this particular leader. And also the ways in which you can see the manipulation of people via the evangelical machinery, which then brings people out on the streets in support of the president thousands of miles away. Without even knowing probably sometimes what they are supporting. So what remains always then is a series of conflicting representations, but above all, a definition of an unrelenting humanity for African people, from what it takes to survive in the harshest conditions to how one begins again after everything falls apart, but also definitely for us, to know how one lives a life of beauty and joy in spite of it all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Boyce Davies. Thank you so much for your interventions, very timely. And I turn now to Professor Boggs. Anthony Boggs used to be our colleague at UWI. He's a writer, scholar, and curator. He has published 9 books in the fields of political thought and critical theory, Caribbean intellectual history, and Caribbean art. He is currently working on a book titled Black Critique and a Project on Politics in Jamaica in the 1970s. He's also co-editing some of the unpublished writings of Sylvia Wynter and editing a volume on Haitian art. He is the Asa Messer Professor of Humanities and Critical Theory at Brown University, the inaugural director of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice at Brown University, and a visiting professor and curator at the University of Johannesburg. He has curated art shows in the Caribbean, South Africa, and the USA. And yes, he did his PhD in political theory at UWI Mona. He will speak to us now on the university, knowledge, and transformation. Over to you, Professor Boggs.
I want to begin by thanking the University of the West Indies for asking me to make a few remarks around the topic of activism and the university. My remarks will circle around 3 things: the university, knowledge, and transformation. Let me begin by congratulating the Vice Chancellor, Sir Hilary Beckles, for his work at the University of the West Indies and the ways he has led the university over these past several years. I also want to congratulate him on his work as chairperson of the CARICOM Reparations Commission. Through this work, he has placed on the Caribbean political agenda the question of reparative justice. This is a much needed requirement for Caribbean political and social life. So once again, my congratulations to the VC. Let me turn my attention to the hub of my remarks: the university, knowledge, and transformation. Universities are always products of their societies. They are enmeshed within the political and economic and social context of their own historical origins, as well as the contemporary context. At Brown University, where I worked for the last 15 years or so, the historical context was or is racial slavery and secular colonialism in what is called the England Atlantic states, or the New England Atlantic states. New England was a region where Brown exists. New England is a region where there's a conventional historical American narrative about the Puritans and the city on the hill. But however, we have a different understanding of New England and the context of New England and these English Atlantic states. It was, in our view, not in our view, but historically we have proved, it can be shown, that it was actually the critical epicenter of 2 founding acts of America as a colony. First, that of racial slavery, and second, of the dispossession of the indigenous populations. The state of Rhode Island, where Brown is now located, was a key port for shipping, for the building of slave ships, for outfitting these ships. It meant that there were whole communities involved in the slave trade, from outfitting the ships to what I would like to call from the candlestick maker to the carpenter, who were involved in involved in the making of these ships and outfitting them for the slave voyages. The cities of Boston or of Providence were central to the insurance and banking relationships that were necessary for these slave voyages, as well as for the financing of the slave plantations in the Caribbean. The centrality, therefore, of New England to plantation slavery suggests that we might need to rethink the so-called triangular trade, Europe, Africa, America, and the Caribbean. That not so much to think the entire circuit of the trade, but to think about the nodes on the trade and the actual traffic and circulation between the actual nodes in these trades. Providence became not only the shipping epicenter and commercial outpost for the selling of goods to the Caribbean and food, as well as furniture to the so-called British Caribbean colonies, but it was also a place where the indigenous population were enslaved and sent to. Places like Barbados, places like Bermuda were all places that the British had, and that in which they actually particularly sent indigenous people from New England to these particular regions and sent them as slaves. When we think of the entire Caribbean, not just the British-speaking Caribbean or the British colonies, we have a family in New England called the DeWolf family. It lives in a place called Bristol. The Wolf family were the single largest plantation owners in Cuba. So therefore, it is safe to say that the New England area was formed as an English colony, but was formed in forms of servitude and dispossession. Servitude and dispossession of the African and indigenous population. As I said before, universities are born in context. And that is the kind of historical context in which Brown was born. And so that is the context of dispossession and racial slavery. So in 2003, when the first African-American president of Brown, Dr. Ruth Simmons, decided that we needed to understand and come to grips with the connections of the university to Atlantic slavery, she formed a commission. That commission produced a report in 2006, and I was a member of that commission and part of the writing team. That commission did a couple of things, which I will elaborate now. Firstly, it made it clear that racial slavery in the United States was not simply a Southern phenomenon. By thinking about or pointing to the ways in which New England and particularly Providence was important in the trade, the slave trade, was also an important node in the trafficking between the British colonies and the West and New England. By pointing to the questions of finance and other commercial activity, it showed that we were able to show in the report that the slavery was not a Southern phenomenon, but actually also a Northern phenomenon. And that the so-called American Republic was not just an American republic, but actually an American slave republic. The second thing that we did in the report that is important is that we began to argue that the coming out, particularly influenced by the Durban Conference, that racial slavery was a crime against humanity. And that becomes very important in the United States to begin to think about the raising the level of the understanding of racial slavery. Not that it was kind of parochial, not that it's okay, it's just a Southern thing, or that it really was a horror story, but that really it was also a crime against humanity. And that as a crime against humanity, our third major point in the report was that it constituted an enormous historical injustice of that time, but also, quite frankly, an historical injustice that has reverberations and echoes in the present moment. Coming out of that report, so there are a couple of things that we recommended. One, that there be a Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, which we now have. Secondly, that we wanted to pay attention to the public school system in Providence, And this is important because the public school system in Providence is very much based upon what some of us call a school to prison pipeline. It is a public school system in which kids of Black kids who are immigrants from African Americans, as well as immigrants from Cape Verde and Africa, as well as other kids from the Hispanic population, find themselves in schools that are not only run down on with curriculum, which are not organized in ways in which in a modern way that can satisfy the need of these kids, but essentially that the public school system becomes really as I said, what we call a school to prison pipeline. And all the educators who have done examinations or reviews of public school systems has rated the Rhode Island public school system as one of the worst in the United States. So one of the things that we have done or pay attention to is actually how to work with this public school system to make sure that it can change and reform itself from just being a school to prison pipeline. And the other thing that we have done is that that was recommended was that we wanted to make sure that there was a memorial on Brown's campus. That, therefore, is a brief background to Brown as a university born out of the slave trade, where we actually tried to confront that from 2003 to the present time, and the institutionalization of a center and a set of some programs which we can talk about that deals with this business of historical justice and how to deal with it on what we call through forms of reparative justice. The university, as I said, or universities in general, are knowledge production entities. So how do we transform ourselves? And obviously one way of transforming ourselves is the curriculum. That is what it is we teach and what kind of research do we do. Part of these efforts goes under the title of how to decolonize the curriculum. But it is also not about decolonization just of a curriculum, but also how to deploy methods of critical pedagogy, whether or not we will do what Paulo Freire calls the banking method, or we want to do a different kind of teaching with criticism. That is to actually pull out of our students and learners a critical approach to the material that they are looking at. So we ask ourselves at the CSSJ, that is at the center, how it is that we can develop critical pedagogies, both for our own research and teaching, but also for what we call public humanities. In other words, what are the things that we need to do? And for us, we begin with what is missing in the conventional curriculums. And then from there, we begin to develop new curricula as well as different methodologies of teaching. All of this business of decolonization and different methodologies and what it is missing in the curriculum, as you all know, has a very long history. Beginning in the 1960s in the English departments at Makerere University in Uganda, also then with the Nigerian universities who were doing rethinking and reimagining African history. Then the universities of Dar es Salaam University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, thinking about development studies. And then with our own University of the West Indies, with people like Elsa Govaya, thinking about West Indian history. Later on, Caroline Cooper, thinking about reggae studies, and Rex Neckerford, obviously thinking about business of cultural studies. And so for us, therefore, the business of change is really about what it is that you teach and how you teach it. Since, as I said, the university is about knowledge production. I want to end with this final comment. I was trained in political theory in the University of the West Indies in the 1990s, in the Department of Government. And so I have to ask myself over the last couple of years of being a scholar, what would political theory and my training look like? if in fact we had politics linked with history. I myself was fortunate in that I had Professor Auger to teach me, and Professor Neckleford was a member of my committee, my thesis committee. But I wonder what we would think about, how we would think about decolonizing political science today, in turning it into something of political studies, not just political science which only focuses on questions of governance, but really thinks about political studies as it has to do with questions of political culture, with questions of mass political parties, and with with questions of change and transformation in our political systems of the region. The university brings to any society ideas which will unsettle it. Research needs to do that. It needs to be, or what I like to call, trouble the waters. It needs to be unconventional. It needs to be unconventional because it also needs to attack the problems or to address the problems of a society. Not in any kind of instrumentalist or utilitarian way, but in ways in which will create debate and hard conversations. Debate and hard conversations are not luxuries. They are the lifeblood of any democratic society. As such, all universities, I think, face at this time the business of how to create knowledge for democracy, how to construct intellectual practices that will facilitate, in our case, the growth of the Caribbean within itself, the growth of the Caribbean, but also a way in which the Caribbean can examine itself as a one way of trying to understand itself in order to forge ahead as a civilization. But not just as a civilization writ large, but a civilization which places at its center the aspiration, desires, activities, both historical, cultural, and otherwise, of ordinary people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Boggs. And now I have to follow your act by making my presentation. So here I go with my presentation: Higher Education, Social Justice and Anti-Racism, University Curricula and Civil Society Agendas. A university must demonstrate its activism, not only in public advocacy, but also in its teaching and learning, its ethical interactions, and its global engagement. For the UWI, activism is a strategic imperative and not an activity. So said Pro Vice Chancellor Dr. Luz Longsword in her presentation, The University of the West Indies, an Activist Global Engagement Strategy. It was that strategic imperative demonstrated in teaching and learning at the UWI after its establishment in 1948, which identified us as a university engaged in education for transformation, transformation of our people grappling with the disease of colonialism and post-colonialism. Using the discipline of history, I argue that our project as historians has always been to use our scholarship to create new knowledge, dethrone the old Eurocentric absolutisms by writing revisionist texts so as to address the roots of racism and nudge us towards social justice. Our responsibility in the post-colonial period was to write our own content and create our own curricula to ensure that students graduated from the UWI as self-confident human beings, armed with the knowledge of their past origin and culture, proud of their heroes and heroines, and exposed to a more liberating narrative of self, free of racist, sexist, and classist ideologies. This was a necessary project because, as Elsa Gavaya said, and I quote, "In a region such as ours, where shame about the past too often fills the place that should be held by knowledge, knowledge of the past must play its part in our liberation from the bonds of the past," end of quote. The UWI has intentionally, in my view, used history education as a pedagogical tool to examine the roots of racism and social injustice in the Caribbean, and to train graduates to engage in applied history in our efforts to effect change in the larger society. As both PVC Williams and PVC Longsword have explained, the strategic plan of the UWI under Vice Chancellor Beckles is in fact grounded in a AAA strategy: access, agility, and alignment to the needs of the region. We have also gone outside of the walls of academia to meet the needs of civil society because of the preference for scholar activists who participate in educating our people outside of the classroom. Indeed, some UWI academics have become revolutionary intellectuals because to be a revolutionary intellectual, according to the late historian Walter Rodney, helps to provide a point of reference to the struggle of Black liberation. Stated differently, we have tried to find the panacea for racism and social injustice. Indeed, if a panacea is a solution or remedy for difficulties or diseases, and if the disease we have faced in the Caribbean is colonialism, then the University of the West Indies was established to treat the diseases that the colonizers did not cure after being in the Caribbean for over 3 centuries, exploiting our human and natural resources for their own benefit, and leaving us physically and mentally as sick as ever. The University of the West Indies with British funds started in 1948 as a medical school to address tropical diseases and its social manifestations, perhaps a sort of compensation for centuries-old neglect, but would soon expand to embrace the humanities and engage in the writing and rewriting of Caribbean history. It was the history departments of the UWI that were tasked with engaging in the project of decolonizing the colonial narratives and addressing the African identity theft that sought to mentally enslave the descendants of enslaved Africans. Staff in these departments on all 3 initial campuses joined the communities of scholars to destabilize the colonialist historiography, presenting Caribbean people as victims of colonialism, yes, but also as survivors of the Ma'afa and contributors to Caribbean and world civilizations. Historians, many trained at the UWI, provided the historical justification for the elevation of our own icons and showed where history sits at the crossroads of monuments, memorials, and memorialization after the atrocity of enslavement. The philosophies guiding the historical archaeology in which we engaged since the 1950s resided in the works of regional and diaspora scholars. Eric Williams provided the hard facts of Europe's economic underdevelopment of the Caribbean, illustrating in his 1944 work, Capitalism and Slavery, that the Caribbean was the site of the formation of European ideas of modernity and their constructions of notions of hegemony. And all of us who live in Caribbean space have been deeply offended by the actualization of such notions of hegemony and conducted such notions in our, and countered such notions in our counter discourses. Marcus Garvey encouraged us to regard ourselves as Africans and reconnect with Africa. Molefe Kete Asante inspired us with his theory of Afrocentricity, and Sheikh Anta Diop firmly connected us to pre-colonial African civilizations and cultures. We used the gendered historical research of Lucille Mathurin Mayer, the rehabilitative ideas of Frantz Fanon and Amy Césaire, the work on Haiti of C.L.R. James, and the revolutionary precepts of Walter Rodney as he showed how Europe underdeveloped Africa. The project was not easy. The dominant note in the inherited writings, for example, from around 1880 to 1900, was imperialism, justification, encouragement, defense, and apology for colonies. Even in the early 20th century, authors like Charles Lucas and Rhodes Chair of Imperial History at London, A.P. Newton, were still writing in the imperialist mode, and few challenges were forthcoming. A change only became noticeable in the post-World War II period. The escalation of decolonization movements and the re-empowerment of non-Western states signal a more democratic intellectual age. One decisive trend after 1945 was that the Eurocentric tendencies of the earlier works were increasingly overtaken by the revisionist approaches of a new generation of scholars who grounded their work in solid archival research. These Caribbean-born writers questioned the essentialism of the traditional historiography and master narrative imposed on former colonized peoples, and they introduced their own discursive practices. In the post-1970s in particular, there were renewed attempts, though not always successful, to dethrone the old intellectual absolutisms and introduce new interpretations of Caribbean history. The history of the Caribbean continues to attract the attention of modern scholars on both sides of the Atlantic. And the historiography is not now only vast, but on the whole empirically rich, intellectually gripping, and conceptually contentious. The perspectives have not been unified. Rather, two distinct trends are still observable in the writings on the colonial Caribbean. One, imperial stroke colonialist, the other distinctly revisionist and located firmly in the Creole or Black nationalist genre. We also took practical steps at the university, introducing courses that would reorient the thinking of our students away from pro-colonialism, especially as it related to the representations of indigenous peoples and African people. Our historians have rooted out the myths of extinction of the indigenous peoples, told the truth about Columbus and his financial backers, about who must bear the bulk of the responsibility for the African Holocaust, about colonialism and its deforming impact, about the true freedom fighters, African soldiers, and non-military people with boots on the ground who forced abolition and emancipation. We have taught the roots of Caribbean underdevelopment, including the indecency of the compensation paid to enslavers at the time of emancipation, and finally about the struggle for decolonial justice through the franchise movement, labor protests, independence, and reparatory justice. Today, no one believes in the myth of discovery, in the post-conquest work's tendency to negate or minimize the role of the indigenous peoples in the advance of Caribbean modernity, presenting both text and subtext that projected perceptions of the indigenous Caribbeans as a problem for colonial development and an obstacle to the European march to progress. In the characterization of our heroes and heroines as rabble-rousers and criminals who upset the peace of plantation society through their activism. The Eurocentric tendencies of earlier works were increasingly overtaken by the revisionist approaches of a new generation of scholars who questioned the essentialism of the traditional historiography and master narratives imposed on former colonized peoples and introduced their own discursive practices. We can safely say that as historians, we responded to Walter Rodney's charge. In his paper, The Role of the Historian in the Developing West Indies, Walter Rodney, the quintessential scholar activist, argued persuasively that, and I quote, "It is one of the tasks of the historian of the West Indies to approach society in a different manner and to lay emphasis on precisely what was going on in the region. This would certainly lead to the presentation of new heroes with whom the West Indian people would identify themselves, an important psychological necessity," end of quote. He argued that the UWI should assume responsibility for popularizing such knowledge, and we have been doing so. Indeed, Walter Rodney's conscientizing method of groundings is much used, along with media, to allow our people to understand the roots of racism, the impact of identity theft, and the road we all must travel to end Caribbean disfigurement at the hands of colonizers. We must, of course, insist that reparatory justice is due to us from those who gave no respectable golden handshake to independence negotiators, as Professor Hilary Beckles has been telling us from his recent research, so that they could truly address the colonial mess of landlessness, poverty, environmental degradation, which leads to climate change and vulnerable settlements, structural discrimination in education, and inadequate social infrastructure. Higher education institutions have not been aloof from this topical issue of reparation, whether as special reparatory justice projects or as part of their history and law curricula. I do not have to tell this audience of the engagement of US universities with this topic or movement. Universities like Brown, Georgetown, Yale, and Harvard have been confronting their past and thinking of ways to make amends. UK universities like Cambridge, Bristol, Glasgow, Edinburgh, and UCL all have task forces studying those institutions' connection to slavery and discussing reparatory justice responsibilities. For example, there is now a University of Glasgow UWI Center for Research located at both universities, and the impetus was the reparatory justice movement. Hopefully, they do not research and run, as the Vice Chancellor likes to say. Let me say this as I conclude. Despite the efforts of historians to bridge the distance between past and present, not only in our writings, but in our scholar activism, the concept of distance still affects the success of our activism. Historians have pushed the idea from the time I was an undergraduate to the distant past, that distance gives us the detachment we need to form a dispassionate view of the past, all in the name of what modernists call objectivity, the antidote to blind prejudice. For Mark Phillips, historical distance refers to the growing clarity that comes with the passage of time. But my question is, what happens when we seek to hold those whose ancestors were responsible for certain actions in the past accountable in the present? Accountable in the present time to descendants of those who suffered the initial harm. Framed differently, what happens when in the contemporary we attempt to use knowledge of the past to liberate ourselves from the bonds of the past and also attempt to convince states, financial institutions, insurance companies, churches, educational institutions, and individual descendants of perpetrators that they have obligations that date back to 1492, even if we are now in 2020. From the perspective of the CARICOM Reparation Commission, there is absolute clarity that the too far in the distance to have contemporary application is unacceptable. Distance only affects how we think about the past in the sense that we have mined the past, despite the intervening years, to intensify our resolve that between 1492 and now has simply given us time to reflect on how much evidence we now have to push the demand. We cannot see any applicability of objectivity or find any balanced view to project about enslavement. Maybe we are too related to the events of the past and cannot untangle the relationship between past and the present as they are so inextricably tangled. Thank you very much. Mr. Ian Randall is up next. I think we all know Ian. Many of us have been published by Ian. He is founder and current non-executive chairman of Ian Randall Publishers, the premier non-commercial academic publishing company in the English-speaking Caribbean. A special honors graduate in history from the University of the West Indies, he read for a master's degree in international politics on a Commonwealth scholarship at the University of Southampton in the UK. He holds a diploma in publishing from the University of Denver Publishing Institute and served on its faculty for several years. Ian Randall has served as advisor to a number of regional governments in the training of personnel. And also he works on the production, he still works on the production of educational material for the educational system and with the Jamaica National Commission on Reparation as a communication consultant. Active in publishing development, he's founder and first president of the Caribbean Publishers Network called CAPNet, and has received international recognition by being named a laureate of the Prince Claus Foundation. He is a recipient of a Jamaica National Honor, the Order of Distinction, OD, a Silver Musgrave Medalist at the Institute of Jamaica, and an Honorary Doctor of Laws from the University of the West Indies. His presentation is called Publishing as Activism. Over to you, Mr. Randall.
I'm pleased to be included in this discussion, the universe in an age of activism. Particularly pleased because as publishers, we're often left out in the loop, and yet without appearing immodest, I think publishers represent an important part of the whole academic enterprise. I'd like to frame my presentation within the context of a brief overview of the UWI's development as it relates to activism. I discern three distinct phases of this development. Phase one, comprising the period from the establishment in 1948 as a colonial offshoot as a college of the University of London, up to the period of Caribbean independence in the first half of a decade of the 1960s. Operating in the classical mode of British universities, UWI's sole mandate was to prepare a new generation of professionals and leaders to assume leadership roles at all levels and without question. Phase two, the post-independence years up to the last decade of the 20th century, is what I would describe as the activist phase, characterized by leadership of the New World Group and scholar activists like Walter Rodney, Lloyd Best, Kamau Brathwaite, James Millett, and others, who openly challenged the persistence of the colonial basis on which, as independent nations, we continue to run our politics, economies, and relations within our societies. These challenges, or activism, as if you will, run every level, in the classroom, in public discourses locally and internationally, and in their writing and publishing. Phase three coincides with the period of neoliberalism, free trade, and globalization, and is characterized by a distinct departure from the activist agenda of the earlier period. The UWI has had to satisfy and bow to the increasing demands of contributing governments to broaden the base, even as it faces the challenges of limited financial resources and competition from universities within and outside the region. This I would describe as a utilitarian phase. I regret to say the UWI continues to operate in this phase today. This is not to suggest that there has been a total departure from its activist role in both challenging old shibboleths and providing solutions for 21st century problems. But there's no question that with the exception of a few of its faculty, we see, feel, read, and hear less from the UWI as an institution on issues that affect the society as a whole, particularly at a time when the intellectual leadership of the faculty is badly needed. Publishing is an essential tool in the pursuit of an activist agenda. For better or worse, both the UWI Press and the Randall publishers emerged towards the tail end of the activist phase. And we didn't exist then when we could have had a more decisive effect by publishing and more widely disseminating the work of these academics. We were not around then to challenge the false designation of the UWI as an intellectual ghetto. While I would not necessarily categorize IRP as an activist publisher, I can say we have deliberately sought over the past 30 years to give support to voices in the academy whose work has extended beyond the confines of pure academic research for its own sake, and active promotion of the work of faculty, especially younger faculty members, whose research is intended to inform action and which openly challenges established dogma and entrenched interests. So while we support the philosophy of publish or perish, IRP has never been interested solely in the work of academics who seek to publish in order not to perish. From conversations with Sir Hilary Beckles during his tenure as chairman of the board of the UWI Press, I know that his philosophy is to see the UWI Press as an extension of the UWI's research agenda, and rightly so, that publishing the research work of faculty should be its priority. We have no such mandate and have never confined ourselves to the narrow interpretation of scholarly publishing. If we had our way, in fact, we would have liked to have seen a more deliberate policy by UWI of directed research with clear publishing outcomes for public consumption aimed at informing policy in critical areas of national and regional life. In the absence of more of that targeted research and in support of individual academic initiatives, our publishing activities have sought to both extend and complement the central role of the university press. None of this is to suggest that publishing the research work of faculty and providing an outlet for activist causes and issues of wider public interest are mutually exclusive. One of the most important works appearing under the UWI Press imprint is Hilary Beckles' Britain's Black Debt, which has become one of the most referenced works in support of the reparations movement. Similarly, Vereen Shepherd's Livestock, Sugar and Slavery is a revised outcome of her doctoral thesis and published by Ian Randall Publishers. Academics can and do advance the research agenda while being advocates for a variety of causes beyond their main teaching, administrative, and research responsibilities through their writing, publishing, and participation in public discourse. No one more exemplifies these qualities as a quintessential public intellectual than the UWI's current Vice Chancellor, Hilary Beckles, who, having established himself academically as the region's preeminent scholar historian, has throughout the entire span of his career openly and bravely embraced issues ranging from the mutual affair in Barbados to the reform of West Indies cricket, up to his current leadership of the reparations movement. Far from being seen as contradictory to the purely administrative role as head of the region's premier academic institution, Hilary Beckles, through his intellectual leadership, the authority he brings to the challenge to the destruction of the remnants of our colonial past, and his vision for the UWI in leading the region out of persistent poverty, is precisely the kind of transformational leader that university and indeed the region needs today to meet the numerous challenges we face. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ian. And may I offer my own congratulations to you and Ian Randall Publishers on 30 years in the business. Well done. It is now the turn of Ambassador June Suma from the UWI's Open Campus. Dr. June Suma received her PhD in history from the University of the West Indies in 1994. She lectured at the University of the West Indies as well as other universities in the United States, for example, and also worked for 10 years at the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank in the Human Resources Department, the Research Department, and the Strategic Policy Unit. She has served as St. Lucia's ambassador to the OECS and CARICOM with responsibility for diaspora affairs, and she served there from 2008 to 2016. She currently serves as the Secretary General of the Association of Caribbean States, the ACS, and many people know that she's described as a woman of many firsts. She was the first woman to receive a PhD in history from the University of the West Indies Caveville campus, the first woman to serve as St. Lucian ambassador to CARICOM and the OECS, the first woman to serve as an OECS commissioner, the first woman to be ratified as the Secretary General of the Association of Caribbean States, and the first woman to perform the role as chair of the Open Campus Council of the University of the West Indies. Dr. Suma served as a member of the St. Lucian Reparations Committee and presented the inaugural lecture on the occasion of the launch of the St. Lucia Reparations Committee. Her presentation was entitled The Reparations Movement, a ragtag collection of racial malcontents marching to the beat of their own drum? Question mark? And her presentation is diverse. It offers praise to the University of the West Indies. It also expresses some cautionary notes. And nevertheless, she recognizes the way in which the university pursued its mission. Throughout all of this, praise, cautionary note, her love for the UWI shines through. So I give you Ambassador June Suma.
I am grateful for the opportunity to participate in a conversation that gives me the opportunity to say thank you to an institution that has guided the evolution of my philosophy on the importance of the role of regional institutions like this in shaping not only the discourse, but the policy formulation and development trajectory of small island developing states like ours. It is with great admiration that I pay tribute to the Vice Chancellor, Sir Hilary Beckles, for his priceless, selfless, and sometimes thankless contribution to the advancement of my outstanding alma mater for the past 40 years. My gratitude to both for shaping me as a female leader. Vice Chancellor, your determination to put a graduate in every home to ensure that the OECS, the urban poor, women, and rural communities have been serviced has not gone unnoticed by both your supporters and your detractors. I commend you on the legitimacy that you have brought to our history, our current struggles, and your push for more democratic, equitable, and equal societies for the future. I wish you many more years at the helm of the university. I recall 2 years ago at an open forum on the way forward for the university held in St. Lucia, I asked the question, why is the university not producing any more intellectuals in the vein of great activists like Walter Rodney? You see, I had witnessed the creation of great intellectuals over the years, but none that would translate it into community-based questioning that would ensure populations became involved in changing their societies. Universities have been at the heart of all great cultural, social, and political movements globally. Frankly, I think that the university is producing safe thinkers, many of whom have been dominated or even co-opted by political, social, and economic thought that they do not influence or even understand. We have been encumbered by the ideological underpinnings that have hindered our activism and stalled our decolonization process. I believe that is the reason we have been hesitant in acting courageously, resolutely, and decisively with regard to critical issues such as climate change, which devastates our poor and vulnerable, with regard to racism in our countries, while we have whispered that Black Lives Matter, and we have not removed the symbols that keep us colonized. Where are the underlying theories that the then doctors, Beckles, Duncan, Nurse, Barito, and I use names from MPhil because that is where I got my degrees, and so on, encourage as the foundation of our thoughts? Where is the critical thinking that encouraged us to rethink what we thought we knew? Where are the students that we have produced? Why have they retreated into landscapes of detachment, comfortable that the system works for them, never mind their communities shrink into further depression? We cannot build resilience. We cannot build sustainability if our university does not speak to the strategic opportunities to tackle the major issues, such as decolonization, racism, inequality and inequity, racial justice, the rights of vulnerable groups such as women, indigenous people, and migrants. What has happened to our thought on regionalism, development, and new opportunities? The university must speak to the architecture for getting these issues resolved so that critical thinking, governance, institutional building, and leadership can become the root of our reinvention. If my thinking is to have any traction, then the university cannot itself regress into a comfort zone that is satisfied with 1 or 2 or 3 persons speaking to the matters that concern all. There must be a crescendo of voices. The leadership of the university cannot be seen to be protecting the interests of the few and the continued entrenchment of the values of a colonial and racial elite that has reinvented the plantation and wields new whips that increase poverty and reinforce division. where apart from a few who speak with authority and intellect is the kind of leadership that galvanizes action, innovation, and sustainable change? Where is the intellectual rigor of the university? I make these remarks fully cognizant of the recognition of the university's global ranking, aware of the Vice-Chancellor's work and that of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, mindful of the Open Campus's mandate to create a graduate in every home, and conscious of the global expansion and awareness of the university. In the context of a dynamic global environment, it is increasingly essential for institutions like the university to feel the heartbeat of the people and to reach beyond its proverbial four walls to give life to our communities. For it is in reinventing, in this empowering, in this iteration of the university that we will prosper. I have deliberately refrained from saying the University of the West Indies and have conceptualized my thoughts in a university that fully embraces notions of a regional leadership and population that has mined the intellectualism of the UWI without ensuring that it bore fruit. You see, I am a graduate. I am part of the university and I want it to thrive. I am tired of retreating, of holding back the legendary tongue of the Black woman explored by Lucille Mathramia. I am ready for the next phase of my activism. I am part of the academy. I am part of the university. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And continuing to sing, in a sense, praise songs to administrators at the university who are activists, I now turn the floor over to Dr. Henderson Carter. He is a senior lecturer and head of Department of History and Philosophy at the University of the West Indies, the MPhil campus in Barbados. He teaches West Indian history, US history, and Barbadian business history. He taught at the St. Anthony's School, where he was deputy principal between oh my goodness, you're a historian, but it wasn't 1987 and 1995. At Queen's College from 1996 to 2009. And of course, at the University of the West Indies from 2009 to the present. He holds a BA honors in history and political science from UWI MPhil campus and an MPhil in history with a thesis on the history of the rum enterprise in Barbados and a PhD with a thesis on post-slavery protests in Barbados. He also holds a certificate in university teaching and learning from the UWI. He's a published author of several books. He has authored BIM, A Business History of Barbados from 1900 to 2000, Powering Our Nation's Progress, A Story of Electricity Service in Barbados, 1911 to 2011, Switching On with Elcock for 50 years, A History of Everson R. Elcock and Company Limited, 1961 to 2011, and A Man Called Peace, the story of Eric Hassel and his shipping enterprise. Dr. Carter has served as a convener of the Caribbean Examinations Council, CXC, and he actually recently served on the history panel and the Cape Caribbean Studies subject panel. He has conducted several seminars on the teaching of West Indian history in Barbados and in the region. I told you it was a continuation of praise songs that you have heard interspersed through other presentations. But his presentation is titled, Sir Hilary in the Trenches for Social Justice. Over to you, Dr. Carter.
I am particularly pleased to participate in this forum, the University in the Age of Activism, and to isolate the special contribution of Sir Hilary Beckles, my mentor and thesis supervisor, to the development of the university and the region. My first encounter with Sir Hilary was not in the classroom, but on the cricket field, playing for the UWI in a BCA intermediate competition in 1985. During the cricket season, the university was due to play against Dover Cricket Club, but the club had included a West Indian cricketer who had earlier toured South Africa. The historians in the UWI team called for a boycott, and after much discussion, the UWI team withdrew from the match. We were wrongly criticized for this stance in the media, but we had made our point. This was one of Sir Hilary's early fights against apartheid. When I met him in the classroom, I was blown away by the structure and coherence of his lectures, punctuated with pertinent examples, delivered only with a small piece of paper in front of him. His early scholarly piece on the 1816 rebellion in Barbados provided the inspiration for me to delve into the realm of resistance for my PhD thesis, for which Sir Hilary was the supervisor. That PhD journey, looking at post-slavery resistance in Barbados, helped us to advance the thesis of Boyce as leader of the Barbados War of 1816 and placed him firmly in the consciousness of Barbadians. Many administrators simply hold the fort. But for Sir Hilary, his scholarly activism has been critical to the social and economic advancement of Caribbean societies in 4 significant areas. First, Sir Hilary has led the way in the fight against apartheid in South Africa in the 1980s and the persistent battle for reparations in the last 2 decades. In the latter quest, he has gained significant admiration and respect in the region and, of course, in the global community. Secondly, he has significantly improved the lives of many marginalized persons in the region in his quest for greater access for Caribbean people to university education. Indeed, the expansion of the MPhil campus and the global movements of the university have created opportunities for our people to realize their dreams. Thirdly, he has fought a long struggle to improve the circumstances of marginalized persons in Barbados through his quest for economic enfranchisement. This battle in Barbados in 1988 and 89, which became known as the Mutual Affair, laid out the framework for a struggle which still continues today. And fourthly, Sir Hilary has not only lectured, but has written and published extensively on topics such as the slave trade, slavery, resistance, post-slavery conditions, cricket, and reparations. For me, his most important activist work would be Britain's Black Death, with a photo of Queen Elizabeth II on the front page receiving a gift from her cousin at the Bell Plantation in Barbados in 1966. The front page of that book also displays a photo of a coffle, an African slave coffle, on its front page. In this way, the activist scholar is not simply waving a placard, but placing his scholarship to be scrutinized by all. I see Sir Hilary's sojourn at the University of the West Indies, therefore, not as 40 years in a position, but 40 years in the trenches, fighting for social justice and transforming the lives of marginalized people through access to higher education and advocacy. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Henderson. And in a sense, we're going to end the way we started, with a performance by M. Norbesi Philip. M. Norbesi Philip is a poet, writer, and lawyer who was born in Tobago and now lives in Toronto, Canada. She's a graduate of the University of the West Indies, where she received her BSc in economics and a master's in political science. She has a degree in law from the University of Western Ontario in Canada. She practiced law for 7 years in Toronto, where she completed 2 books of poetry. In 1983, she gave up her practice to devote more time to writing. Although primarily a poet, Norbesi Philip also writes both fiction and nonfiction, and published 3 books of poetry. In 2001, she was recognized for her work as a revolutionary poet, writer, and thinker by the Elizabeth Fry Society of Toronto, which presented her their 2001 Rebels for a Cause Award. That year, she was also the recipient of the YWCA Woman of Distinction Award in the Arts. In 2008, the Mercury Press and Wesleyan University Press published her collection of poetry titled Zong! Based on the murder of Africans on board that infamous slaver that I told you about at the beginning. A dramatized reading of this new poem cycle was workshopped and presented at Harbourfront in Toronto as part of Rock, Paper, Sisters. I give you Ms. Philip.
The first thing I want to do is to thank Sonia Stanley Neer for inviting me to participate in this. It is close to my heart, both in terms of the work itself, but also because UWI Mona is my alma mater, and much of who I am and how I locate myself in the world and the work that I do and my thinking began in those 3 formative years at Mona, Jamaica. I've never been back since. I would love to come back. I thought I was going to get back a few years ago and it didn't happen. I wanted to do languages, but I ended up doing political science. Archie Singham was my professor. And in my year, there were, Carl Stone was in my year, Rosina Wilshire, Rupert Lewis. So it just brings to mind to me that some of the finest minds in this world come from the Caribbean. And it's a place that is dear to me, that I think has always punched above its weight. And so I am particularly impressed and committed to what the university is doing, which is, I think the logo was the University in Age of Activism, or so that idea appeals to me very much. I also want to mention Opal Palmer, Professor Opal Palmer, Professor Vereen Shepherd, who last year we tried to get something going that didn't work. I want to acknowledge that. And I just want to say once again, I'm humbled and I'm extremely grateful to be here, to be saying a few words. I'm going to just say a few words about Zong, the work. Professor Shepherd has done extensive work on this. I came to this work, I studied law in Canada, became a lawyer, practiced for 7 years before leaving to write poetry and to write in general. And the reason I did that was, I shouldn't say the reason I did that, one of the things I realized when I left law was, well, I think it's really important that we go into the professions and we occupy them fully. I had this belief that the people who are doing the work of healing us from that particular traumatic experience that I think we're just beginning to perhaps plumb the depths of, are going to be our griots, our storytellers, our dancers, our artists. I think those people carry a certain, I don't want to say burden, but maybe an obligation, a gift that helps the collective soul to heal. And we see it in the music of our people. I came across mention of this case in a book by James Walvin, an English academic, called, the book was called Black Ivory. And he mentioned this case. He called it one of the most uncommon cases. And I remember I was very shocked by it. And maybe I photocopied the pages because he actually had the legal reference, which is Gregson versus Gilbert. I filed that away and put it into my filing cabinet. Some years later, I thought to myself, I should go to the law library and look up what this case was all about. And it really shocked me when I got there, because the only public record of this case, Gregson versus Gilbert, exists in one of these published case reports, and the case is 2 pages long, the case report. And I remember when I looked at it, I remember the thought I had then: how could the murder of over 130, the numbers always seem to me to be quite slippery, between 130 and 150, the case report says 150. How could the murder of 150 people just warrant 2 pages? I photocopied the case report and took it away, and I think a couple of years later began working on it. Here's where it connects with my study of law and practice of law. When you study law, what you're doing a lot is you're reading a lot of cases. And as you read the cases, you actually see, with some of the important cases, you see how they travel up the appeal ladder, so to speak. And as they travel up the ladder, all the messy human attachments, those things that make us human, get squeezed out until when it gets to, whether it was the Privy Council or today we hear about the Supreme Court of the US, when it gets there, it's always on this 1 or 2 esoteric points of law. Knowing that from having spent 3 years reading cases and reading case law, I was convinced that the stories of those people were locked in the words, that 2-page report. And the challenge for me was, how was I going to release those stories? I initially decided I would just use the words of the report, and there are about 500 different words in that 2-page document. I would just use those words to write the poem. And then a couple of years later, I kept having this impulse to what I call break and enter the case report. And finally, I decided I would do that. And what I mean by break and enter, I decided to sort of shatter the words to see what other words lived inside those words. And I did that by making a dictionary or dictionaries and then finding the poems there. And exactly what I thought, that the lives of those people on board that ship, Zong, are locked in that case report. And that is what produced this particular work, Zong. What I say about Zong is that it's a story that must be told, but it can't be told. And what I mean by that is that we can never tell the entire story of slavery. You know, we don't know about everyone who died and suffered through this. So there's a sense in which there's an impossibility there, but we must tell the story that can't be told. The other part of that statement is it can only be told by not telling. And I think that's where poetry comes in. I mean, because poetry often tells by not telling. And I also want to reference another son of the Caribbean, Glissant, who talks about the right to opacity. And it is that opacity of the not telling. And so there's a sense in which even today, as I was walking this morning, I was thinking, I don't know the stories, even as the stories were released. I don't know those stories. I don't know if I even want to know them, but something in reading these poems over and over again, we bring these ancestors, they may not be our blood ancestors, but our group ancestors, we bring them back and we say that we are remembering them. The first part of the work, which I called os, which means bone, I really had this overwhelming need to name these people who died, not unnamed because they had already been named, of course, but in the slave ledgers, in the ship's manifest, it would have been Negro man, Negro woman, Negro child, and so on. And so floating below the poems, I have, throughout the entire book, in fact, there are 115 names of people. What I did, I looked at names from all over the continent, because the trade drew on the entire continent, so to speak. And so that's how Zong came about. One of the things that I've been doing for the last 7 years, this will be the 8th year. The book was published in 2008. And I began doing this in 2012, which is I asked people if they would come together and we would read the book together, either on the anniversary of the beginning of the massacre or sometime in that 10-day window within which the massacre happened. And so it usually goes for several hours. We have drumming, we have food, and it becomes a sort of watch night. Christina Sharp talks about wake work. I call it grief work, which I think is really important for us to do. And we in the Caribbean know how important these celebrations are, these memorials, 9-night, 40-night, and so on. And so this year, because of COVID, we can't hold the embodied reading. And so I thought to take it online. And it has, I was telling Sonia that just as I got her email, I said to her, we were in the throes of trying to organize this. So for 10 days, we will have a combination of 3 live stream readings of people getting together and reading. And the other 7 days, we will have pre-recorded readings of either groups or individuals who have chosen, who've been assigned pages of Zong to read. And in that way, we'll read through the whole book. And so I'm, again, to echo what I said at the beginning, I'm sincerely and deeply humbled and grateful to have been asked to participate in this. And if anyone is interested, the website is zong.world, and you'll find all the information there. And I'd just like to close by reading one poem from the first section of Zong. It is Zong number 15. All the poems in the first section are numbered. Defend the dead. Weight of circumstance. Ground to usual and etc. Where the ratio of just in less than is necessary to murder. The subject in property, the save in underwriter, where etc. tunes justice and the ratio of murder is the usual in occurred. Aquila. Follow pay. Follow pay. Follow pay. Jubade. The just in ration, the suffer in loss. Defend the dead, the weight in circumstance, ached in necessary, the ration in just, age the act in the our way to justice. Masire, Ndale, Omowunmi, Ramla, Ajani, Ajani, Ramla, Ramla, Ramla Weke, Ajani, Nobale, Mesire, Mesire, Jubade, 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 Mesire, Mesire, Mesire. Thank you.
It's hard to find words. No, Basie. That was absolutely moving. Well, thank you so much. All that is left for me to do now is to thank all the participants for their excellent presentations, their statements, their remarks, their greetings, their dramatic acts. I thank the staff of the Center for Reparation Research for their hard work in helping to put this forum together, working with the director and staff of the Institute of Caribbean Studies, also working with the technical folks at MITS, Mona Information Technology Services, because together they all ensured that this forum was successful. I do not think that anyone who listened today can be in any doubt about the changing nature of higher education institutions, which operate nationally, regionally, or globally, or indeed on all three fronts, to destabilize that ivory tower designation. Even if that is how many started, judging by the interventions today, administrators and scholars have long shunned the path of the classic intellectual, associated traditionally with ivory tower and snobbishness, despite the persistence of this meaning of the intellectual in the popular perception. We share the views articulated so well by Edward Said, that the intellectual is an individual in society that confronts orthodoxy. And dogma, who cannot be reduced simply to being a faceless being, a faceless professional, a competent member of a class going about his or her business, but an individual endowed with a faculty for representing, embodying, articulating a message, a view, an attitude, a philosophy or opinion to, as well as for a public. That the intellectual must hold to certain universal standards of truth about human misery and oppression, despite his or her national background or class affiliation. That sometimes the public intellectual must be prepared to be an exile and marginal. What would?